It's that time. We're about to kick off an episode of Consulting Unfiltered. We're here to share the real talk on career growth in finance and consulting. You want to be a CFO? You want to get to partner at a firm? Learn from true stories on how to achieve these goals. We will not hold back on anything. Get ready to laugh, learn, and level up your game. Today, we're going to talk about, is it possible to create a fraud-proof business environment, or is some level of fraud inevitable? We're going to discuss the effectiveness of prevention strategies versus the reality of human behavior. Welcome to Consulting Unfiltered Adventures in Leadership. In today's episode, we're discussing experiences with detecting and preventing fraud. I like how everybody always whispers that, by the way. Preventing fraud in clients' businesses. What are the common warning signs and effective prevention strategies? And we're joined today by Laura, who has the most experience here at our firm with fraud. So Laura, tell us a little bit about your background in relation to fraud.
Well, with the fraud, it all started, I was in my 20s and I was working for a country club. And I had a few jobs. I was doing data entry at the time, and I was also going to school for accounting. I actually came across fraud on that job. There was one day I was going through some of the paperwork and saw there was a deposit on a sheet crossed out. And on another sheet, there was one that was whited out. And it made me start thinking. And so I went in over the weekend and I started going through paperwork and going through all these details. And I found there was embezzlement happening. And so that took me down the direction of fraud investigation. And I was very interested in it.
Mm-hmm. I like that. And you've done some courses towards forensic. It's because we call this forensic accounting, right? That's what the official term is.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have done some study towards being a certified fraud examiner.
Very good. That's a pathway that people can take. I don't even know if that it's, again, I talk about all the time, nobody knows the different positions. So in a consulting firm, people come in and specifically hire consultants to look because they suspect fraud. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Wow. And I think that one of the ways, this is one of my first questions, is what is the most common types of fraud that we uncover? But I think before answering that, what are the most common types of situations, right? So like I can think of one, which is divorce, right? That is, I think, a very common one when people say, okay, we're going through a divorce. And then all of a sudden everybody's like, well, where's all the money at? And so we have to go in and figure out, not necessarily fraud per se, but just where did that cash go? But what are some other kind of situations where people might, like situations in a business life where they might consider that fraud might be happening?
Absolutely. Well, around payroll, employee embezzlement, actually we have seen that already this year. You don't have good controls, so segregation of duties. And so people can do all kinds of stuff. So if you're processing payroll and let's say your CFO approves it, but then you go and you're the one who uploads it to your payroll company, or you're the one that processes it in your QuickBooks file, well, who's checking after that? Mm-hmm. And so at those points in time, sometimes they're going in there and, got an extra 40-hour vacation check, or they have an extra 3.5 hours overtime. And it happens over and over again. And I think I've probably seen that more than anything else. Other things I've come across is we review financials all the time. So we go through and we do a review of the file. And I like to pull up that balance sheet and start digging in because that's where I see all the good stuff for fraud happening. If you see revenues are overstated and quarter to quarter, and all of a sudden you see a big spike, maybe there's something going on. Same thing on the expense side. Maybe expenses are understated. Accounts receivable. Maybe accounts receivable took a spike and it's not coming down. Why? Accounts payable we look at too. Maybe there's a lot of vendor credits happening that just don't make sense. It's not something that companies had before. So it's just digging in and seeing what you can find. And usually you find something, because it's hard to completely prevent fraud. Before
working for Armanino, I worked for a manufacturing company, and they had inventory fraud, right? Because so fraud at its essence is some kind of like misallocation or stealing or, something that's happening in a business. And they had what they would buy is they would buy what they consider junk, right? They would buy pallets and pallets and pallets of old computer parts from IBM and different companies like that, and Dell, and they would show up. The pallets would literally show up in our warehouse, and then they hired the guys in the back who were supposed to be in the warehouse and taking apart the pallets and putting them into like all their here's the power sources and power and all these things, all the cords and the processors and all that stuff. And because it wasn't monitored, they didn't have checks and balances. That one of the guys they found out was, just having his own little side eBay business and was selling some of these parts on eBay, which that company was also selling parts on eBay. So inventory fraud as well, right? It's not just, and we hear that a lot too in the like in the field service industry, where a lot of people in the HVAC or plumbing or garage door repair companies, they think, oh, we don't have to track inventory because it's just what my techs have on their trucks. But the fact of the matter is that, the techs, even if it's a small amount of, I remember, so I keep on getting distracted by all of the stories that are popping into my head about the loss, right? Like I remember one time even a house cleaning service, and she was like, they take home my chamois and it is so expensive. And, it is just so, it's constant, right? It's constantly around us. So
I have stories popping in my head too, because it's like there was a restaurant that their inventory, they were like, where's it going? Where's it going? Why aren't we seeing the revenue from this? Well, it's because their general manager was walking out with cases of liquor. So, it's everywhere.
It is everywhere. So what are the early warning signs, right? What are the early warning signs that consultants should be looking out for when they are trying to, start to uncover the fraud? First of all, let's talk about that first, because then the second discussion, right, is how do we start asking about it?
Oh, yeah. So warning signs. When people don't want to talk about it, when they can't explain the discrepancies or variances that you find, missing documents. There was a manufacturing company I worked for, and I just started as their controller, and I went in and it's where I learned file 13 is the garbage can. Their previous controller was taking their invoices, and she didn't know how to do her job. And so she was just putting them into file 13. So when I went there, I had to uncover all kinds of stuff, and I had to go through and call vendors and call clients and find out, try to unravel the mess and find out what was real. So missing documents is a big one. Segregation of duties. Got to have those user rights and roles and get very detailed on that, so what people have access to. And the other thing, when people go on vacation, if they don't like to have someone step in to do their job, is the big one. That was my very first embezzlement back when I was in my 20s. When the controller left, there was one very specific thing I couldn't do. And it was, she would track everything on this big old sales tax ledger, huge sales tax ledger. It's because she worked from the right to the left. So she worked it backwards. So it was something that I wasn't, and no one else was able to do. So it's, they get very protective over certain things because that's where the fraud's happening.
So maybe potentially then a solution for that is to make sure that that's something we do internally and with our clients, is make sure that all processes are documented, right? Because then that is just a second set of eyes. Even if you can't have segregation of duties, having the process documented, and if they fight back on the potential of documenting processes, and then maybe cross training for, say, if you can go, so you can go on vacation or whatever it is, and hearing their response. So it's almost like just having open communication and then listening for the defensive responses is kind of a good first step. Very good. And so then if you start to get that, little spidey sense going off when you're at a client, what are kind of the first things that you can do? Because you can't just be like, burp, right? Fraud. Nope. Yeah. You can't call it out like that. So what are kind of the ways that you can, because if you're wrong, right? What are the first couple steps that you can take towards, verifying?
Well, I think you've got to start doing a little bit of an audit. So going through, looking at the financial statements, seeing what's been reconciled, to be able to even start to identify, because there's so many different things that can be happening there. We do file reviews, data analysis. So going through and looking at KPIs. KPIs can, key performance indicators can really throw light on where fraud might be happening. So when you go through those financials and you're looking for that growing revenue, and you're seeing where that corresponds.
And so the KPIs is because of a change, right? That's where you would recognize, like you're going to see.
Absolutely.
It used to be this. Turnover used to be, ratio used to be. Burp. Now it's not, right? Oh, coincides with new employee who started. Those kinds of things. Okay, so
exactly.
Change.
Audit trail is a big one. So going through that audit trail and seeing if transactions have been deleted. If things have been changed, that's a really great place to look. Reconciliations, to see if reconciliations have been done right. I had a client that had just numbers that were fudged in the system, $10,000 here, $9,000 there. They weren't actual transactions, but it made the reconciliation be able to reconcile, but it wasn't correct. So having those, well, essentially the transactions were misallocated. So that's normally where I start, is just digging into those financials and starting to see where there's even a pattern. Yeah. A pattern for that.
I like that. And so also too, one of the things that I hear in there is that verifying that cash is reconciled is not good enough, right? Because so you have to take it a step further to see some of those things. I remember in one customer that I used to work with when I had a heavier client load, but we would go in once a month and I would review their audit trail as part of their month end close. That was part of my responsibilities as their outside consultant, was to go in and review the audit trail, review the voided and deleted transactions report to make sure that there wasn't anything that looked off, basically, which is taking some responsibility, right? Is me taking some responsibility, but all I'm doing is the second set of eyes at that point, right? So what is the biggest value when we say like worst fraud case? What's the largest value that you saw that was stolen?
So the largest I saw was just over $100,000. Now there was a client that came to me and said, "Oh, well, the previous owner experienced where it was millions of dollars was taken, and it was done through inventory." And then they were experiencing fraud currently, but it was through payroll.
Same company?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. They hit by twice. You think you learned the first time. Oh, that's brutal. Oh my gosh.
Exactly.
How do you ever trust
my
again?
Head. Right.
Oh, I don't know that I've ever heard a double company, a double up like that. Wow. Oh my goodness. I think we had two that were, one I didn't work on, but I did see, there was like $6 million in coins stolen somewhere. I was like, what do we have in coins? And but we also had, I think the worst that I have worked through was a woman who the gentleman was much older. The owner was significantly older, like 85, 90 years old. And I think he lived to well over 100. And he had this woman in the office, and she actually faked cancer to get through some of the fraud. And it ended up being over $3 million. And it was over the course of like 4 years that it was from just little bits from multiple businesses. And you know, what's the recourse on that? There's not very much recourse that you can do because she doesn't still have the money. So yeah, it's real, right? It's those scary stories. We here at Fourlane, we've always prided ourselves that we do not lead on fear, even though in the accounting industry, that's a big thing, right? Everybody leads on the IRS is going to knock on your door, fraud. But the truth is that it's all there. It's still there, even if you don't talk about it. So, what do you think is if a business could do one thing to fraud-proof their business, what would that be? What would you suggest to them as a consultant if they came to you and asked you that?
It's hard to pick just one. Segregation of duties, setting up those user rights and roles.
And that's in the software.
Well, that's in the software. You can also do that in documentation, so you know very clearly who has what role and who can do what. Doing that process documentation so that there's something easy to follow, having that cross-training done. Mm-hmm. But I think segregation of duties is the biggest one, because if back when I was working at that country club, if we would have had that, somebody would have caught it. But mm-hmm. she had carte blanche just to do everything.
So one of the things I always tell businesses, so as a consultant, this is something that you could utilize, right? When you're going in, because as a consultant, you're selling yourself you're a salesperson. You're selling yourself, you're selling your brain, you're selling your knowledge, your ability to help this business. And to me, one of the most effective things that you can do is have a consultant, even if it is, Laura's just going to look at the books once a month and that's just what it mm-hmm. is. Knowing that there's a second set of eyes, I think prevents any kind of activity like this from happening far more than not knowing that a second set of eyes is going to come in and take a look, right? So I guess that kind of plays to segregation of duties as well. The other thing I just thought of when you were saying that, though, is, a lot of times when people come into businesses and they see like all these processes set up, or they see like, Laura has to review my time cards before they're submitted. A lot of times people take that as micromanaging. Right. And so maybe we have to take a step back too and realize, maybe we're not micromanaging. Maybe there was some reason that we had to set up all these processes, and maybe somebody in leadership had been or felt burned before. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So what are some of the challenges in addressing, so let's say now we've verified, yes, there is fraud. What are some of the challenges that you have in what you do next? First of all, what do we do next? We verified, we're pretty confident that something's going on here. What do you do?
Well, it's having that honest conversation of what's been found and to go through the results. Start with that month end close and go through and show them, here's what we have found. And at that point, I think we need to get into what do we do next? If they've got no controls, they don't have people that are trained to see the fraud. Mm-hmm. We've got a lot of training to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also too, so when we have those conversations, I remember this wasn't a fraud situation. This was just a not trained situation. I had to go tell a director of a nonprofit that they had a variance of $4 million in their revenue. Well, they had too much revenue. They didn't realize that they had $4 million more in revenue than they were supposed to have, which sounds like a good problem to have, right? But it's not really supposed to be happening mm-hmm. in business, or you have to pay more taxes or whatever it is. So this was just, gross negligence. But those conversations are very hard to have. And then the leaders in those companies, that's where, as a consultant, when we say, 50% of our job is to be a psychologist, is we have to help those leaders because they are down. They just found out that their most trusted person at their company, they can't trust, or they just found out that several employees stealing, right? Like they are down, and we have to help them to see that like light at the end of the tunnel. So yeah, that is part of this, 50% psychology over here too, that we always talk about.
And it's hard because, you're nervous, and, it's a very uncomfortable situation when you're taking that folder in to go have a lunch somewhere with the board of directors, and you're going, this is what I found, guys.
Yeah. And then too, sometimes even I've had that where I'm like, okay, which one of y'all can I trust? Are you in on the, then I'm like, who am I talking to? Am I talking to the right person?
Exactly.
Boy. All right. So our big question for the audience this week is it possible to create a completely fraud-proof business environment, or is some level of fraud inevitable in a business? I know, again, I had one customer, they was a bar owner. She owned several bars, and we walked in and we're having a lunch meeting with her, and she said, "Oh, you have," or I saw somebody taking money from behind the counter, right? One of her bartenders would just pocketed the tip instead of putting it in the central tip jar. And her response when we presented that to her she said, "Oh, he steals less than the rest of them, so he's fine to stay." So we know that there is some inevitability, right? Some businesses weigh those risks and reward, but is it possible to completely eliminate it? So you let us know what you guys think. And Laura, thank you so much for joining us again today. And that's it, y'all. And that's a wrap on another amazing episode of Consulting Unfiltered. Don't miss out on all the candid chats and practical wisdom coming your way. Hit that subscribe button to stay connected and keep taking those steps forward in your career. We'll see you soon.